At a family party, my brother laughed and said, "This is the loser of our family?" While my mom just smiled and nodded in approval. My husband stood there in silence while his mother mocked my salary, calling it pocket change, and treating my hard-earned money like her personal property. They thought I was the one who needed them, but I was the one who pulled this entire life together all by myself. What they didn't realize? The loser at the table was the only reason their bank accounts weren't empty. I didn't just walk out. I signed the permanent foreclosure on their arrogance before the main course was served. The room burst into laughter as the sovereign of our family, my brother Marcus, lifted his glass for a toast. But the toast wasn't for a celebration. It was a surgical strike aimed directly at me. "To the executive package of our family," Marcus sneered, gesturing to my parents, "and to the permanent janitor of our reputation, Evelyn." He leaned back, smug and enjoying the moment, and said the words that would change everything. "This is the loser of our family." Beside him, my mother's social mask was perfect. She didn't defend me. Instead, she smiled, that tight, approving smile that said I deserved to be put in my place. I looked at my husband, expecting a resolution, or at least a supportive hand, but he just stared at his plate, terrified of losing the glow of his mother's inheritance. Then came the mirror paradox of the evening. My mother-in-law leaned in, her voice dripping with the medical shock of fake concern. "Oh, Evelyn, don't be so sensitive. With your modest salary, it's a miracle we even let you sit at the main table. You should be grateful we manage your husband's finances, or you'd both be ghosts in a one-bedroom apartment." I looked my husband straight in the eyes and warned him, "One more word from your mother about my salary, and there will be no more polite conversations." He flinched, but he didn't speak. He still thought I was the loser they had spent years convincing me I was. What they didn't know was that while they were busy playing architects of my humiliation, I had been the one who pulled this entire lifestyle together all by myself. I had signed the Vantage point agreements that funded my brother's failing business. I was the secret power behind the trust fund my mother-in-law used to bully me. I stood up, the resolution finally clear in my mind. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just pulled out my phone and sent a single, surgical strike of a message to my lead counsel. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice a sovereign bell of truth that silenced the room. I looked at my husband and his mother. I'll explain to her myself where her place is, and why my money is not her property. I walked toward the hallway, leaving them in the glow of their own ignorance. My brother laughed one last time, thinking he had won. He didn't realize that the permanent foreclosure on his ego had just been authorized. The medical shock of the room's silence after my departure was exactly the mirror paradox I had expected. As I sat in my car in the driveway, I could still hear the sovereign laughter of my brother, Marcus, through the open windows of the estate. He was back at the head of the table, enjoying the glow of the party as if he were a powerful boss who had just secured a billion-dollar merger, rather than a man who had just insulted the only person keeping his executive package lifestyle afloat. "Did you see her face?" Marcus's voice boomed, carrying that surgical strike of arrogance that had defined our entire childhood. She actually thought she could set a boundary at my table. The loser of the family, trying to play the architect of her own life. It's the funniest thing I've heard all year. My mother's voice joined in, her social mask finally dropping to reveal the cold, calculated resolution underneath. "She always was ungrateful, Marcus. We gave her a vantage point in this family that she never earned. To think she'd talk to her husband like that in front of his mother, it's a permanent foreclosure on her respectability." Inside the house, my mother-in-law was reaching her own peak of gloating. I could imagine her leaning back in her sovereign chair, sipping the expensive wine that my modest salary had actually paid for. I told my son from the start that her money was essentially family property. If she's pulling this "I pulled this all by myself" act, she needs a lesson in humility. She's a ghost in this marriage, and it's time she realized that without our name, she's just street garbage. They were all reveling in the resolution of my supposed failure. To them, I was just the janitor who was meant to clean up their emotional messes, while they enjoyed the executive package of my hard work. They truly believed that my silence over the years was a sign of weakness, a medical shock to my own self-worth that allowed them to treat my life like a punchline. "She'll be back," my husband finally spoke up, his voice a mirror paradox of cowardice and smugness. She needs the glow of this family to feel important. She'll crawl back in an hour, apologize to Mom, and realize that her salary is just a drop in the bucket compared to what we provide. I watched the glow of the estate lights, knowing that this was the last time they would ever shine on these people. They were so busy being the architects of my humiliation that they didn't notice the surgical strike I had already authorized. My brother didn't know that the vantage point of his company was built on a series of loans that I had personally guaranteed, loans that were now entering permanent foreclosure. My mother-in-law didn't realize that the sovereign trust fund she bragged about was actually a mirror paradox of debt, managed by the very firm where I was the director of strategic acquisitions. Ungrateful, my mother repeated, the word hanging in the air like a medical shock. We should have left her to figure things out on her own years ago. Let her see how far her salary gets her when she doesn't have the sterling name to open doors. They were laughing again, a sovereign sound of people who thought they were untouchable. They were gloating over the ghost of the girl I used to be, the one who would shrink to make them feel powerful. They didn't realize that I hadn't left because I was hurt. I had left because the timing was finally right to stop protecting them from themselves. I pulled out my phone and watched. The first surgical strike of notifications hit. The estate's executive package service was the first to go. The catering staff I had hired began packing up the sovereign dinner before the dessert was even served. I heard Marcus's voice rise in confusion, then anger as his social mask began to crack. "What do you mean you're leaving?" he shouted at a waiter. "The party isn't over. I'm Miss Sterling." "The resolution of your credit has been denied." "Sir," I whispered to myself, mimicking the sovereign tone of the man in the charcoal suit from my office. The gloating was about to turn into a medical shock of reality. They wanted to call me a loser? Fine, they could see how it felt to be the architects of their own permanent foreclosure. "Mom, call me when you cool down," I had told her in my final text. But as the lights in the estate flickered and died, a surgical strike on their power, I knew it would be a very long time before any of them felt cool again. The medical shock of the estate's power cutting out was followed by a sovereign silence that stretched across the lawn. Inside, the glow of the expensive chandeliers had been replaced by the dim, frantic light of cell phone screens. I stepped out of my car and walked back toward the front entrance, my heels clicking against the stone with a resolution that felt like a surgical strike against the night. I wasn't the ghost they had dismissed an hour ago. I was the architect, coming to witness the permanent foreclosure of their arrogance. As I reached the threshold of the dining room, I saw Marcus screaming at a man in a charcoal suit who had just walked through the garden doors. My mother-in-law was clutching her pearls, her social mask completely shattered as she demanded to know why the executive package catering team was loading the lobster back into their vans. "This is an outrage," Marcus bellowed, his voice a mirror paradox of his earlier smugness. "I am the CEO of Sterling Consulting. You can't just cut the power to a sovereign event." "Do you know who I am?" The man in the charcoal suit didn't flinch. He was the same man who had been checking facts near the drinks all evening, the man Marcus had ignored because he wasn't a powerful boss in his eyes. He adjusted his cuff and spoke with a calm that made the medical shock in the room intensify. "Mr. Sterling, the vantage point you think you hold is an illusion," the man said quietly. "The credit line for this estate, the executive package accounts for your consulting firm, and even the sovereign trust fund your mother-in-law has been bragging about were all frozen 10 minutes ago." "Frozen?" my husband stammered, his face a mirror paradox of pale white and sweat. "On whose authority? My wife is the only one who has access to those backup codes, and she's just a loser with a modest salary." I stepped into the light of their phone screens, a secret power finally radiating from me that none of them could ignore. "On mine," I said, my voice a sovereign bell of truth. The room went deathly silent. Marcus turned toward me, his powerful boss persona crumbling into a medical shock of confusion. "Evelyn, what surgical strike of a joke is this?" The man in the charcoal suit turned toward me and bowed slightly, a vantage point of respect that made my mother's social mask tighten in horror. "Director Carter," he said clearly so everyone could hear. "The restructure is effective immediately. As the architect of this acquisition, do you wish to proceed with the permanent foreclosure on the Sterling accounts? Director? My mother-in-law gasped, the medical shock making her sway on her feet. What director? She's a janitor of numbers. She told us she had a modest salary. I never told you my salary was modest, I said, walking toward the head of the table. You simply decided it was because it made you feel like a sovereign to believe. I was beneath you. I pulled this entire life together all by myself. While you played with executive package toys that I was secretly funding through Horizon Equity, the secret power I had held for 5 years was finally out in the open. I looked at my brother, whose powerful boss lifestyle was nothing more than a mirror paradox of debt that I had been quietly managing to protect the family name. But after tonight, Marcus, I'm taking my hands off the wheel you never learned to drive. Mother stepped forward, her voice a surgical strike of fake sweetness. Evelyn, sweetheart, you don't have to do this. We're family. Marcus was just joking about the loser thing, he revealed himself, in front of everyone with a resolution that made her flinch. I just stopped protecting him from the gravity of his own arrogance. You smiled when he called me a loser. Now you can smile while the architect signs the permanent foreclosure on this estate. I turned to the man in the charcoal suit. Execute the status flip, I said. I want every sovereign asset associated with the Sterling name liquidated by Monday morning. As the man nodded and began speaking into his phone, my husband looked at me like I was a ghost he had never met. He had let his mother treat my money like her property, and now he was realizing that the permanent foreclosure wasn't just on his bank account, it was on the glow of the fake life he had built on my silence. The secret power was no longer a secret, and the janitors of their own destruction were finally standing in the dark. The medical shock of the family estate, falling into darkness, was the ultimate resolution to a decade of being treated like street garbage as the sovereign assets of the Sterling name began to dissolve. The guests, the very people who had clapped when Marcus called me a loser, were now executing a surgical strike of their own, scurrying toward the exits to avoid being associated with a permanent foreclosure. I stood in the hallway of my childhood home, no longer a ghost, but the architect of a new reality. Elena, you can't be serious, my husband cried. His social mask completely melted away into a mirror paradox of terror. You're going to put your own family on the street? Over a few jokes at a party? It wasn't just a few jokes, I replied, my voice a sovereign bell that echoed through the empty dining room. It was years of you letting your mother treat my money like her property. It was you watching me shrink while you enjoyed the glow of a life I built for you all by myself. The status flip isn't a punishment. It's a correction. By Monday morning, the executive package lifestyle my brother Marcus bragged about was a ghost of the past. I sat in a glass conference room overlooking the city, the vantage point I had earned through silence and hard work. The man in the charcoal suit handed me the resolution papers. The Sterling estate was gone, sold to a sovereign developer to cover the massive debts Marcus had hidden behind his smug, powerful boss facade. My phone buzzed. It was a text from my mother. We have nowhere to go. Marcus's accounts are empty. Please, you pulled this all together before. Do it again. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. I had already executed the final surgical strike. While they were packing their executive package suitcases into a rental car, I was signing the deed to my own sovereign estate, a property they would never be invited to enter. I wasn't just moving forward. I was finally standing up in a world that had tried to keep me as a janitor of their failures. Later that afternoon, I drove past the old family home. I saw my mother-in-law standing on the sidewalk, looking like street garbage, as she argued with the movers about a sovereign vase she claimed was hers. My husband stood beside her, looking small, a ghost of the man who once mocked my salary. He looked up and saw my car, the executive package, vehicle he used to tell me I couldn't afford. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I just met his eyes through the tinted glass, a mirror paradox of the moment he had ignored my warnings at the party. The status flip was complete. They were now the ones figuring things out, while I took the vantage point that belonged to the architect of the family. Was it worth it? My mother-in-law screamed as I drove away, her social mask finally gone. I looked at the city skyline, the glow of my new life reflecting in the rearview mirror. I didn't do this to hurt you, I whispered to the empty car. I did it to stop shrinking. The medical shock of their betrayal had been the surgical strike. I needed to finally become sovereign. The permanent foreclosure on my old life was the best investment I ever made. No one would ever call me a loser again, because the truth had finally stood up. The medical shock of total insolvency hit my husband, like a surgical strike to his very soul. A week after the permanent foreclosure on the family estate, I was sitting in my new sovereign office, watching the cities glow through the floor-to-ceiling glass. My desk was clear, except for a single resolution document, the final divorce papers. When my husband was finally allowed up by security, he looked like a ghost of the man who had sat silently while his mother mocked my salary. "Evelyn, please," he stammered, his social mask replaced by the raw panic of financial ruin. The bank took the cars. Mom is staying in a motel that smells like street garbage. Marcus is being investigated for the executive package of offshore debts you uncovered. We're family. You pulled this all together before, you have to do it again. I spun my chair around, the vantage point from my position as director making him look smaller than he ever had at the dinner table. "I didn't pull it together for you," I said, my voice a sovereign bell. "I pulled it together despite you. You watched your mother treat my money like her property. You called me a loser because I didn't announce my secret power every time I walked into a room." He reached for my hand, but I pulled away, executing a surgical strike of movement that left him grasping at the air. "I can change," he pleaded, the mirror paradox of his desperation reflecting the years I spent begging for his respect. "I'll tell my mother where her place is. I'll make her apologize for every word about your salary. It's too late for polite conversations, David," I said, sliding the resolution papers across the mahogany. "The status flip is absolute. I've already filed for a surgical strike divorce. Because you failed to protect the sovereign bond of our marriage, you're now just another janitor of the sterling debts." The medical shock on his face was a mirror paradox of the night at the party. He looked at the papers, then back at me, finally realizing that the architect had finished the blueprints for his permanent foreclosure. "You're leaving me with nothing? I'm leaving you with exactly what you gave me." "A hallway of silence and a ghost of a future," I replied. "The Horizon Equity Board has already accepted the surgical strike on your mother's trust fund. Since she believed my money was her property, I've decided to take her advice and manage it myself by dissolving it." As security escorted him out, he looked back at the glow of my office one last time. He was no longer a powerful boss. He was just a loser who had bet against the wrong variable. The financial ruin of the family was complete. Marcus was facing permanent foreclosure on his freedom. My mother-in-law was learning what it felt like to live on a janitor's budget. And my mother was left sitting in the hallway of her own regret, waiting for a call that would never come. I walked to the window, the resolution of my life finally standing up on its own. I had pulled this all together all by myself. I was no longer shrinking. I was sovereign. The glow of the city felt like a reward for the years of silence. The status flip had cost me a family of ghosts, but it had given me the vantage point I deserved. As I closed my eyes, I knew that for the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving the medical shock, I was the architect of the cure.